heard many people use the phrase blank is now X years old, and then using that statement as an opportunity to wax lyrical over said blank piece of media, feeling old in the process. I've always wondered what it might be like, as someone who spent their teenage years gaming predominantly on the 7th generation of consoles. Hearing the stories of those who would reminisce on classics such as Deus Ex, Half-Life and Final Fantasy made me think about when I'd do the same for the games I was currently playing at the time. Save for some fond memories of my Game Boy and PlayStation, I was very much in the midst of building my own bedrock of nostalgia, which I think I've now finally started to strike as I mine my feelings for clarity on how I feel now that the original Borderlands is 10 years old. A decade is a long time, but looking through the lens of games makes me realise just how quickly it can actually fly. I'm still young, sure, but in an oddly self-indulgent way this still makes me feel slightly old. Perhaps this is just an indirect appreciation for that period as a teenager, a point where time really did feel like it would stretch on forever. The bubble you were in, playing games with friends after school or at the weekend, seemed like it would never pop. I think for anyone who is engulfed in a specific interest or hobby during this time of their life has that soft spot of fondness for the suspension of life that the time really was. And so to skewer a particularly nostalgic quote from Stephen King, I never played games later on, like I did when I was 12. One of those games was Borderlands. 2009 had a clean divide in the number of games that were sequels and new ideas. Next to your Modern Warfare 2s, Left 4 Dead 2s and Halo spin-offs, you also had new IPs like Demon's Souls, Bayonetta, Prototype, The Saboteur, Brutal Legend and Dragon Age. In retrospect, it was a rather interesting and varied year for games. Batman Arkham Asylum saw the breaking of a trend of terrible licensed games, and Platinum really staked their claim as the emerging action developer to watch. Bayonetta was followed up by Vanquish that following year. All the while, sequels were genuinely iterating on ideas founded by games they succeeded and cementing design sensibilities that would go on to define the generation. Modern Warfare 2 in many ways providing the contemporary template for AAA games, with its sweep of single-player, multiplayer and co-op offerings forming a wholly broad package, with the aforementioned multiplayer also becoming the default template for many games of the generation, and even now. It's interesting to consider 2009 as a bit of a generational watershed, as after it, the split between original properties and sequels tipped more and more towards the latter. Arguably, the current years of publishers debating the value of franchise investment over new games and live service models rejecting single-player traditions has its roots weeded in 2009 and onwards. Given the circumstance, relative to any media, there is the chance for cult hits to surface from the depths of a crowded landscape, and among the range of games from its year emerged Borderlands. In many ways a plucky little game developed by Gearbox Software, a somewhat unproven studio, Borderlands was positioned as a self-declared role-playing shooter, a game that would merge the loot and RPG progression of a Diablo with the active mechanical engagements of a first-person shooter. At the time, industry analyst Michael Pachter believed the game would fail on account of it being a hybrid, positing that players that were fans of either style would rather play a game dedicated to that singular genre rather than one that considered both. Of course he was wrong, and with the benefit of hindsight, one could see the success of Fallout 3 the year prior as a tip towards the idea of people being open and in fact enthusiastic for the blending of genres. Borderlands went on to sell 2 million copies by the end of that year. If you've come across this video and watched up until this point, I'd assume you already have a familiarity with the game's development, specifically the well-documented change to the visual style. After discarding the idea of a realistic look, Gearbox went back to the concept art for inspiration and conjured up what we have now. It's something close to cel shading, but with distinct modelling and inked outlines that give the game a moving comic book flavour, punctuated by the iconic freeze-frame panels announcing your allies and enemies with a tongue-in-cheek title card. As a result, the game hasn't aged much at all, and is still as distinctive to look at as it was back in 2009. More pointedly, however, is how the story of the game's 11th hour art change might be an avenue into a question. Exactly how much of that Borderlands DNA was really there to begin with? The series is now synonymous with a bombastic, over-the-top and comedic take on the sci-fi dystopia, and in many ways that tonality and approach is peppered throughout the original game. But that's really all there is, a mere sprinkling of what was to come laid on thick in the sequel. Borderlands 2 makes looking at Borderlands all the more interesting because with the loud, colourful confidence of the sequel in mind, the original is a shockingly modest game in comparison. In the first Borderlands, you spend a good few hours scrapping with skags and cycling through rusty, crappy weapons in the opening acts of the game. The occasional group of bandits pester you and you pester them back, but really this is a very humble start to a game that, even within its own marketing material, is set up as a rollicking, joke-filled and explosive adventure. In reality, Pandora is quiet, and the soundtrack twangs with swamp guitar riffs and a distinct backwater sound that really sells the Dust Bowl heat of such an egregious planet. It brings a tone closer to that of a western, which is nonetheless reflective of the game's core loop, putting you in the role of a prospector, but instead of searching for gold, it's loot, guns and of course the elusive vault. Narratively, it goes even deeper, with the featuring of in-universe corporations each having a stake in fracking Pandora for its resources and the conflicts and consequences of their butting heads. It manages to be quite cohesive in its own right. A space western, what's not to love? However, this is where I assume the game's mood was solidified and therefore put on pause during development, because it is what carries Borderlands throughout the entire duration of the core experience. That's not to say there isn't any of the synonymous series humour, but it is to say that if the game was a cake, it had been baked, plain yet perfectly content and satisfying on its own. But before it was put on the shelf, someone came back and put multicoloured icing and sprinkles all over it. Now that's an incredibly silly and reductive metaphor, but it's sort of the only way I can interject into my point here. That point being, what come as staple elements in the sequel and thus have come to define the series, the characters, the humour, function more as items put on top of an already conceived foundation, rather than ingredients worked in and with right out of the gate. It's not as if the amusements aren't there, the dialogue is snappy for the most part, it's just noticeably sparse in its inclusion. The quests for Borderlands 2 are opened and bookended by contextual dialogue that makes substantial use of its massive cast of characters. There's an unfathomable amount to the script of the sequel, to which the original is quite the low-key affair in comparison. Most of the quest givers are silent mannequins with little to differentiate them from one another. Shep Sanders is indistinguishable from Ernest Whiting, both of whom are equally as unremarkable as Hudson Johns. They do not talk, they do not function in any way other than as reskinned bounty boards. What they do, however, is contrast with the key players, the likes of Marcus, Claptrap, Patricia Tannis, Zed and the like, who actually have distinct looks, voices and to a decent degree personalities. These more recognisable characters are the ones given a little more legroom for expression, but these instances are still frugal, with only retrieved echo logs as a platform for their musings. They barely chew your ear off like they do in the sequel, not even quests are verbally contextualised, instead done through the written word. These notes are easy to skip by, and as such many of the tasks you perform feel really distant and cold, like abstract checklists rather than requests from any real characters. This all contributes to a lonely feeling of play, which is admittedly lessened by co-op but nonetheless reeks of an attribute inherent to its underpinning genre. The sparseness of the frontier American West is captured in sci-fi replication here, all because of what the game doesn't have, which is why I could never complain about all of these things as a negative per se. What Borderlands lacks in comparison to its sequel is everything that helps it carve out an atmosphere of its own. Again, take the soundtrack and combine it with the barren landscapes and you have a distinct feeling of the game world being a hostile and desolate one, which is convincing given the nature of such a damning planet as Pandora. My nostalgia wasn't wrong on this one. I remember this mood, and it was something I was craving upon my return to the game. Spending a lot of time in Firestone gets you used to the idea of wandering around, alone and in a place that doesn't really want you there. Yet the oddball characters and dialogue add touches of human familiarity to this otherwise alien place and help generate the game's own tonal landscape, setting it apart from most other games, especially those of its time. There's something weirdly homely about it as you come to familiarise yourself with the game's various idiosyncratic tendencies. This is, after all, still a game where you find loot in dirty toilets and electrocute little psychos until their eyes pop. A lot of games have bandits, but none of them are like the Borderlands bandits. Maniacs scream, bruisers taunt, and in between are the guys that want to make you squeal before they cook you. Plenty of fun is had with the more defined characters too, like Scooter and the such. It's not a matter of whether someone is insane or not, rather it's a matter of the degrees in which they are. Everyone on Pandora is just that little bit crazy or obsessed, and it's perhaps the most consistent element of the comedic throughline. It's unequivocally aware that it's a game too, at first in subtle ways, specifically the habit of purposely obtuse platforming. Diegetically, some of the feats you pull to reach secrets make no sense unless viewed through the common understanding of video game technicalities. I.e., it doesn't make sense that your character as a person with 2 legs can stand on an uprooted pipe or flagpole, but jumping on top and finding it to be a robust platform is something of a sort of unspoken because video games language. However, this is taken into full consideration by the developers, and it is in fact encouraged through directed objective markers that require you to engage with the environment in this particular way. The same goes for grenade and crouch jumping being rewarded similarly. Madness is everywhere in Borderlands, but it is underneath the primary tones of other genres at play. Going back to the original is like looking at land that has only just been planted with seeds of potential fruit. The seeds are there, but they are yet to blossom and grow into their final form and show off above the surface. It's not until the DLC where the game develops its true series identity and beginnings of the sequel's confidence start to emerge. Before looking at the 4 expansions, I'd be remiss to not give proper mention to the core of the game that I've yet to even grace, for my obsession with the game's narrative style has distracted me this whole time from the gameplay. It operates on a simple foundation: you shoot, you loot, and you level up while working your way through numerous open zones split between loading screens. It's not necessarily an open world per se, but a replication of the structure of Diablo, with large plains that facilitate combat, opportunities to grind and house objective markers in, rather than a single world built for exploration a la Bethesda games. You can freely travel between areas, granted that you've progressed to them in the story, and each have access to dungeons and interiors to also fight through. Quests often make sure you explore most parts of any given map, so you'll naturally come across everything there is to see. The tasks themselves are more tasks than quests, however, always predicated on a go here, do this, return kind of structure, consisting of either killing something or fetching stuff. It's repetitive, and with the lack of dialogue, often pretty lifeless as a series of pursuits, but they're not unfamiliar tasks for the genre. See, the RPG DNA of Borderlands is in its loot system and character specification. It's the glue that holds what you're doing together on a moment-to-moment basis. Where the narrative lacks in immediate motivation to commit to certain side activities at hand, that XP bar at the bottom of the screen picks up the slack. You don't question why you keep collecting these random weapon parts as if someone spilt their build your own gun Lego set, because it's for the numbers, for the reward. The satisfaction in Borderlands comes from building a character that grows even stronger to tackle more daunting threats, through better gear and better attributes. To many that may seem like a chore, especially with the modern boom of looter shooters of the same ilk, but to those familiar with this gameplay loop, it's a hook. However, I'd consider Borderlands a better game than many of the current attempts at the formula, even in its underdeveloped form. It stems from the consideration of the game as a single player piece of content, or at least a localized experience, since you can play it in co-op. Either way, not having to bend to an always online formality allows Borderlands to avoid the pitfalls of that model. Namely, the story truly feels like it weaves around you, and that you are a fair part involved in it. Not having dozens of other players surrounding an NPC or bounty board and intersecting with your game allows for an internal consistency within the world, and therefore the narrative of the game. There's no question that you are the Vault Hunter, whereas in, say, Destiny, the idea of being a guardian following a single player narrative path is undermined by the multiplayer. Yet the game still keeps up the pretense that its story has any sort of synergy with that of the gameplay's MMO-like structure. Combined with its self-seriousness, all Destiny's narrative can do is fall flat to the systems of the game, whereas the Borderlands narrative sits nicely alongside its systems and mechanics. They complement each other, and many elements are even built around it to reinforce the aura that loot-centered games produce. the gun manufacturers and lore surrounding them and the game's various corporations being a standout example. The main thread is even about treasure hunting. You're looking for the vault to gain its riches. You're partaking in the game's loop in order to plunder better gear and gain stuff, all kinds of stuff. As a result, there's a remarkable coherency between what the game actually is and how it plays. A coherency that not even Diablo has, as it wanders after world-ending stakes and plot details utterly irrelevant to what you've come to the game for. Borderlands might be undercooked in some of the personality traits that would gain more focus in the subsequent games, but from the very start it understood what it was as a game, and has always closely acquainted that to every narrative premise that it conjures. And those premises only get more creative in the DLC, of which Borderlands has 4. The zombie island of Dr. Ned is the first, and it's a fun one. You travel to a set of areas separate from the main game, namely Jacob's Cove. Right off the bat, Gearbox shows a confident step forward in putting their character humour front and centre. Marcus narrates the opening cutscene of the DLC, claiming Dr. Ned is totally not Zed from the main game, and his storytelling is accompanied by the interruptions of a young boy who will crop up in other openings for the other expansions. It's a cute start, and one that sets the tone for the experience right off the bat with a mix-up of Halloween flavoured horror and humour. Environmentally, the DLC makes a nice shift from what's usual in the main game too. The cove and surrounding areas are of a sickly green palette and generate the wholesomely spooky atmosphere that the intro implies. You'll be fighting a lot of zombies during your visit, and while you might be able to describe the AI in the main campaign as brain dead, here the ghouls function well in changing up the pace of the combat. Quite simply, they run at you, yes, but the game slows down with them. They come at you en masse, and the task is not to get overwhelmed. Their hits significantly slow you down, making it harder to escape, and some special variants like the exploding zombie keep you on your toes regarding what to prioritise. They seem to come from everywhere, and it makes the player never trust that their back is safe. I looked over my shoulder a lot in the zombie island, and that's a good little slip of survival horror mentality right there. Satisfying too is the ungodly amounts of headshots you'll be popping. Many satisfying crunchy headshots. Bring a scoped revolver through and you'll get the itch to pull the trigger for hours. There's even an out of the way quest to collect up to 250 brains, which are retrieved after a zombie's head is mush. The devs must have known how satisfying it was, and so they gave you an excuse to do it for a reward. Good stuff. Tedious, however, if you're not into the core loop of the game. Despite a significant reskin, the quests remain structurally the same as the core experience. Collect this, kill that. The zombie island of Dr. Ned functions more as a mood piece than anything, but the new theme is a functional vehicle for the stab at humour the DLC takes. Dr. Ned's obvious mania is unravelled over the main quest, with echologs charting his failed and ultimately destructive experiments in a fun way. More notably, however, is Ned's active engagement with the player.
Alright, what's Jacobs paying you? I'd offer to double it, but I'm poor as dirt after spending every cent I had into the recreational use of the undead as moneymakers. So far, not digging my plan in hindsight.
In a final push to track Ned down, he radios in to taunt you. It's maybe the first time, or at least the most significant example of Borderlands finally putting an active spin on its characters, rather than relying wholly on the past tense through recorded logs. It adds more immediacy, but it's a shame that it's over so quickly. It barely feels like the personality of Ned gets the time it really needs to stretch, breathe and develop. It's only a handful of missions before the meat of the DLC is over, and so it narratively suffers for that. But perhaps it's for the best, considering the additional content is better functioning as a visual flavour, rather than any significant twist on the gameplay. An overall sentiment that cannot be echoed for the second piece of DLC. Trends are sometimes not massively obvious whilst engaging with them, but looking back it's plain to see that the Dr. Ned add-on was very much in the spirit of a zombie craze emerging in games at the time, next to Call of Duty's Nazi Zombies and Red Dead Redemption's Undead Nightmare. Mad Moxie's Underdome Riot was therefore a Borderlands turn on another concurrent trend, the Horde mode, which Gears of War arguably popularised in its second entry. Many games including Halo adopted the mode, and its strength is as a platform for the inherently solid combat of those games. Halo always excelled as a sandbox shooter, and Firefight was designed as a pure form of that concept, and Gears of War's defensive cover mechanics suited the flow of wave-based survival well. With Borderlands, the Underdome only serves to highlight the shortcomings of the game's combat. Through questing and contextualization, the player shoots in order to progress through an environment to achieve other goals. This DLC removes all of that and goes to show the combat alone isn't what makes Borderlands good. It's the momentum of all the other systems alongside the combat, including the characters and narrative, that elevate Borderlands above its basic foundation. Here it's just the shooting, and it falls bland very quickly. And by very quickly, we're talking 15 minutes max. For the initial set of arenas, there are 5 rounds, each made up of 5 waves. You complete 5 waves to scratch off a round until you've done 5 of said rounds. Sounding tedious already? Well, after the initial set of apparently lesser challenges, you unlock extended versions of them, doubling the length of each to 10 rounds. It's an unbelievable chore, and a grating one at that, since there's nothing interesting going on at all to provide a spin to the combat. There's an attempt with a slot machine that modifies the properties of a wave, an example being low gravity or increased critical damage, but these don't cure an underpinning problem being the lackluster task at hand. Any intended flourishes are laughable, except you're laughing at the game this time rather than with it. Case in point, the boss wave. Conceptually it makes sense as the climax to a set of waves, but the bosses in Borderlands exclusively amount to guy with gun. Easily the most unremarkable part of the game, made even more noticeable when they're all bunched together in the Underdome. Furthermore, loot and experience lack a presence in the DLC. You'd be forgiven for not knowing that guns spawn underneath the central tower of each map after a wave completion, because no attention is even given to the fact, and your reward for finishing an arena is a push to survive those even longer versions. But when not even a single set of 5 waves can hold together as anything more than a snooze-inducing waste of time, doing double is far off the table. Truly, it is uninspired. The exact opposite quality of what has come to be known of the series.
Pandora, a planet that once knew only peace and prosperity under the fair and noble direction of the Atlas Corporation. But there were those that sought to disrupt our perfect existence. Thieves and murderers, perverts and scoundrels. The lawless garbage unleashed an unspeakable evil upon Pandora, not known since the age of the gods. But together we shall not despair. Atlas has not forgotten you. We are returning and will restore order and security to your planet. When we arrive...
While Dr. Ned was a step forward for the game in terms of taking ownership over its inherent wackiness, the Nox DLC sees that tone sewed into more than one strand of the Borderlands experience. It's very much a microcosm of what was to come in the sequel. A more defined central villain, more dialogue from the entertaining side characters, an expansion to the vehicle set, an improvement to interior level design, and a dangling loot carrot on a stick that doesn't get yanked away at the last minute. The content of this third DLC is much more expansive than that of the first, taking place in the parched Fathoms, a dried out seabed that is webbed with long stretches of highways separating zones with a central hub. It's host to the most visually impressive areas of the game, and is distinct as a piece of environmental design in its own right. With its theme, however, comes a lot of driving, which raises alarm bells considering the core game's greatest weakness was in its vehicular sections. Here though, a few minor tweaks make the experience much more bearable. Giving you a tougher car that utilises homing missiles in the form of the monster, it makes the 4-wheeled combat feel a lot less like you're haphazardly bashing Tonka trucks together in a child's sandbox, although it does still boil down to that on occasion. The minor changes here make up to something at least tolerable. The heavy focus on driving in this DLC, however, illuminates an oversight seen in all of the story-based additional content. There's a lack of fast travel between the maps of each piece of content. As a result, and in the Nox DLC especially, you'll be doing a lot of long-winded travel from A to C, And given that the two most distinct zones are literally at opposite ends of the map, forcing you to pass through the hub, it's easier to just quit the game and reload your save. Given that it will spawn you back to the hub by default, it's faster than it would be to make the journey yourself. When quitting the game becomes a mode of engagement with the world, maybe there's something to be improved there. Aside from this oversight, the expansion does add a lot of great things to the game, namely Nox himself. It is in spite of his authoritarian villainy that his reaction to the ludicrous nature of the world he inhabits makes him the sanest person you've met thus far. He is worn and fed up before you even get there. Pandora has truly done him in, and the voice work reflecting that, to my personal taste, is hilariously excellent.
Alright, this is General Knox. I don't really want to be here. This planet smells like hemorrhoids wrapped in bacon. I sent Steel to this planet to take care of this little problem, and also because, seriously, have you heard her? She talks all the time. And hello, have you met our friend the Sun? So, I guess, thanks for turning her into a meat kebab. Also, I'm gonna kill you and stuff. Cheers, mate.
The low-key pathos and self-loathing of his own situation mixed with a casual flippancy makes him an incredibly entertaining villain to go up against. Like Dr. Ned, Nox actually radios in as you make progress. He's reacting to you, completely scripted of course, but it really adds to the unfolding nature of not only the story content but also his personality. I always look forward to the times he would tune in, which is exactly the feeling much of the core game lacked. The same goes for other members of the cast too. Scooter is ever present, Moxie gets a chance to act outside of the Underdome, and a few secondary villains get to crack some jokes too. Gearbox really begins to show love to their world here. It's infectious.
Ice cream day! Oh snap! It's ice cream day! Rocky Road! A la mode! Oh, I'm in the mode for ice cream day!
The DLC for Borderlands takes steps towards improving the consideration given to the level design in many places. In the main game, there wasn't quite the tightness of map design one might expect from a title that makes you do a lot of exploring. Namely, shortcuts and connecting routes were a notably missing element. This forced the player to backtrack through environments they'd already cleared, and given the size of certain zones, it was a chunk of time spent just running, doing lots and lots of running. The Zombie Island saw convenient elevators and looping routes neatly tie parts of a map together, and here the Nox DLC puts in a similar effort to make interior levels much more interconnected, so when you complete an objective, the way out isn't just back the way you came. Call it the fire-linked effect. It was a considerable improvement to the second game, and the roots stem from here. The birth of the Borderlands raid boss took place here too, with Cromrax the Invincible, yet further cementing how it really took until the DLC before Gearbox knew what they had with the original game and how to handle it. But there was still a balance to be struck. Humour in the Secret Army of General Knox mainly came from a sense of both genre awareness but also character personalities and the occasional straight up gag. The final DLC for the game would look inwards at the identity of the content that had come before it and relish in it accordingly. Claptrap's new Robot Revolution is a culmination of everything learned from every experience up until this point. It is the most overtly confident of all the original Borderlands content, unafraid of an upfront comedic premise, fully aware of itself as a game and in its reputation up until this point. It's self-referential and playful in all the tropes established of itself, and these are all good and bad things. It is just more Borderlands, only this time tonally where it was always meant to be. Whereas the Zombie Island of Dr. Ned was a major thematic reskin and General Knox was a change of focus towards world navigation, Robot Revolution is the closest of all the DLC to the loops of the main game. This is not intrinsically a bad thing, just a notable missed opportunity. The scrapyards are back, so are the bandits, spider ants and caves, all familiar locations and enemies that prevent the feeling of coming to something new, which was the strength of the prior DLC. After the visually distinct areas of Nox and especially the Zombie Island, it feels like a step back. There is perhaps a reason for this however, and it comes from the objective of the DLC. Robot Revolution plays as a celebration of Borderlands. Its focus is entirely on riffing off itself. Now this could have worked, and in many cases here it does hit a few fun notes, namely Claptrap's inherent ineptitude as a character makes for an amusing foil when he's positioned as the antagonist, but it all falls a little flat with dialogue that doesn't really take the concept where it needs to go. The Zombie Island of Dr. Ned upended not only its adopted genre, but also the character of Dr. Zed, drawing a connection to the base game in a neat way. The Robot Revolution looks poised to do the same, but its execution is comparatively less exciting. There's no real new twist to the world or gameplay rhythms aside from some visual tweaks to enemies, of which the Hyperion soldiers are obviously clones of the Atlas troops, Scorpio turrets included. It's a little disappointing, not even shooting the many claptraps holds its luster, and the whole Revolution shtick gets old pretty quickly. It's not that the DLC is poorly designed, it's just not providing much in replacement for what it lacks. Considering that most mission objectives remain standard fare, there's not much really adding or changing the experience in a satisfying way. That is when you do encounter something genuinely new. Claptrap's Revolution also recycles most of its bosses from either the main game or prior DLC. You'll refight Dr. Ned, General Knox and Commandant Steele essentially becoming a reskin of the Atlas Assassins from the Nox DLC. And although it's handled in a tongue-in-cheek way, the attitude doesn't slide when you have to fight them all again a second time. Recycling an already recycled set of fights isn't fun, even if you try to joke about it, and although these bosses are far more creative than the ones from the main game, they're still uninteresting to actually fight, being stiff bullet sponges. The idea of reintegrating previous content in order to send the game off in a blaze of glory is sound in theory, but its mundane execution only leaves it to burn out. It's quite the confusing impulse, given that the final encounter of the DLC is a perfect example of how to get it right. After tracking down Claptrap, he springs for one final last stand, calling in a mega robot to destroy you. It's the biggest thing next to the Rat Hive you've ever been given the task of bringing down. It's a tricky fight, nevertheless you end up blowing it up to smithereens. Then Claptrap emerges, trying to desperately rush you before you zap the evil out of him. All of this takes place on a highway behind Firestone. You end the game where it began, fighting the first character you ever met. It goes to show that Borderlands is in fact capable of weaving together a humble little narrative. It just gets distracted sometimes. To return to Borderlands with a critical lens is to acknowledge the shortcomings that were always there from the start. Thinking on it though, I'm not quite certain that shortcomings necessarily means the game fails to land into some well-defined places. In fact, there's plenty for players who are looking for a particular blend of dusty science fiction and humourful tones. The game doesn't quite muster the variety it should, but it does establish a unique world and has an underlying heart and consideration for the player in ways that not a lot of games akin to it do. Credit should also be given to the many standards the game sets in terms of presentation, mechanics and systems, all of which have had a major degree of impact on the many shooters of today. It's just a matter of tolerance. Tolerance for the game's pacing, its tiptoeing around confidence, its sparsity, for the fact that it isn't its sequel. Taken on its own merits, however, the original Borderlands is at least the very consistent foundation for an entire genre to emerge, of which it continues to be the best of.
The box is awaiting your attention!
This'll help.
Hello, and thanks a lot for checking out this little Borderlands retrospective. A few little things just to tag on here in the little casual ending. There was during my playtime of the game and writing the scripts and basically just getting this video done, Gearbox released the Game of the Year edition, which is sort of essentially a definitive edition of the game. It's like a 4K up-res. They did some like UI changes and stuff like that. You know, I didn't actually play that version for this retrospective. I played the original. I was gonna check out the update. I thought it was gonna be a patch for the original game to just update it, but it turns out it's an entirely separate download on Steam. and it was like 20 gigs or something. So I mean, in the middle of this, I was like, fuck that, I cannot be bothered to download it just to check out that sort of the new features they added. But I think they added I think there were some UI changes, an update to the minimap, and I think maybe a few legendary guns, and you know, nothing too major, but maybe just a nice little incentive for people to go back. In terms of the original game, it is perfectly smooth. Everything about it is cool. You know, like it still looks great. So the version that you might want to pick up if you've not played Borderlands or are looking to return to it, maybe after seeing this, I don't know, maybe put a bit of research into seeing which version is better. I heard that the enhanced edition has a few bugs, so I don't know, maybe that's something you want to consider. Like I say, just give it a quick Google to see which one is more stable for you. The original, you'll have to fuck around with some config files to get a field of view, to mess around with the field of view and stuff, to make it a bit more playable, if you don't want it to be this freaking really zoomed in kind of console looking thing if you're playing on a monitor. But yeah, this critique or script kind of sounded, it might have sounded a bit more critical than I intended, or at least a bit more on the constructive criticism angle than more of a, you know, mere praise. Coming back to the game was interesting because it's a game that I love, but at the same time I was able to kind of look through the nostalgia and see where the game kind of falls in terms of its place within the series. Like I mentioned in the script, you know, looking back to it after the other games have come out, it's quite interesting to see how much of a humble little kind of Dust Bowl western it actually really is, you know. So yeah, as much as the script very much is focused on the I guess kind of lacking elements of the game, I think that was something I really wanted to kind of touch on and focus on, considering that it would have been much easier for me to just rinse praise over the thing. But yeah, I feel like I've been balanced, I guess. But yeah, I guess that's where I'm coming from. Like I say, thanks for checking it out, and I'll probably whack a segment onto the next podcast chatting about Borderlands, like I kind of did with the Outlast 2 podcast. And yeah, cool times. Thanks a lot, guys. Catch you in the next thing. Peace.